Good morning and good afternoon from Brussels. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF here in Brussels, and thank you all for joining us for this virtual conversation today on the State of the Union's, the U.S. 2020 elections and U.S. foreign policy after 2020. Actually, it's one of two discussions we're going to have around this topic, one today, one tomorrow. The one tomorrow is going to concentrate more on foreign policy. Today's discussion is going to be all about decoding what has happened. And let me start by thanking the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. We have a partnership between GMF and FEPS. It's been going for a number of years, and it's focused very much on political developments on both sides of the Atlantic. And of course, in this year and in this timing, it's a pretty special conversation. A very big thank you to the entire team at FEPS. We have a wonderful group of people with us today to have this conversation, and it really is meant as an informal conversation, as you'll see. Let me just say a word about them briefly to you before we start. We have with us today Professor Mario Del Perro, is a researcher at Sciences Po in Paris. Megan Greene, who is senior fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Mayor Mitch Landrieu, former mayor of New Orleans and founder and president of Pluribus Unum, and also a member of the GMF Board of Trustees, I'm very delighted to say. And Neera Tanden, president of the Center for American Progress in Washington, and all friends of GMF and FEPS, and really great to have you with us. Thank you. Thanks to all of you again for joining us. You will be able to have, to give me some questions, which I'll try to get into our conversation maybe for the last 20 minutes or so. And you can do that through the Q&A function on Zoom, please. Not the chat function, but the Q&A function. And I'll look at those and I'll try to get to as many as I can towards the end. But first, we're going to have a bit of a conversation amongst us here first. And I'm going to start with just a very obvious question of, what did we see? Obviously, it was a little surprising, a little different than some of the polls might have indicated. Was it about issues? Was it about personality? How do we read this result? Neera, maybe I can, since you're in Washington, it's appropriate for me to start with you.
Well, I don't think Washington has the answers on this one, but I'll try to do my best from my perspective. So I'd like to zoom out a little bit, which is to look at this election in the context of other elections like we've seen. So this is my own view. I consider Donald Trump a sort of very conservative right-wing populist with some authoritarian impulses. We have seen re-election battles around the world with people like Trump. Some differences, but there are affinities between the elections in Poland, Hungary, India, Turkey, a range of countries. We could talk about the UK over the last several years with Brexit. So, actually beating a populist, a kind of conservative populist has been very difficult. In fact, Donald Trump is the first one defeated for re-election when you look at it from a global scale. So what actually happened is Joe Biden put together a new coalition of voters to get, at this point, what will be a commanding lead in actually both the Electoral College and in the public, just, the broad public support. He will likely hit 6 million more votes than Donald Trump. He will hit likely 81, maybe 82 million Americans. This was a surge election on both sides, the highest turnout we've seen in 100 years. But Joe Biden will likely get 306 electoral college votes in the Electoral College, and which is the same that Trump had 4 years ago, except the key difference will be that he is, will likely have millions more Americans support him. And having said that, Donald Trump effectively surged his support as well. These were two mobilized forces in the United States. And, we should all recognize that regardless of the virus or other things, he was able to surge his turnout. But it did not match Joe Biden's turnout, which is a bit of a new coalition. And I think this coalition was one of the reasons why we had a split in the ticket. So the new coalition was made up of the base of the Democratic Party, some weakness among Latino votes in particular states, but in other states, Latinos definitely surged for Biden. So that's something we all have to understand. But the African Americans came out, young people came out. The new surge was also suburban voters. The reason why Joe Biden won Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania is because he outperformed Hillary 4 years ago, both in the city, but also, but much more in the suburbs. So that's white college voters. Now, I do think one challenge is that some of those voters slipped their tickets. Maybe they're just actually relatively conservative and just didn't like Trump as a person. Maybe they heard some of the scare tactics around the Democratic Party. I think one thing all of us have to understand is that Donald Trump has a megaphone unlike any political actor in my lifetime and maybe in American politics. So he can define people negatively. And I do think he had some impact on the Democratic Party. So that is something that we all have to work on. But we should also recognize, and I'll just end with this because I have to say, Mayor Landrieu knows much more about politics than I do. But I do think that we should not lose sight of how hard it is to defeat an incumbent. And Joe Biden will be the first challenger since FDR to get over 50% against an incumbent, which is a hard task, made all the more difficult by Trump's sort of ability to control the media narrative. So this is in my mind, sort of a joyous moment for democracy itself because of Trump's kind of authoritarian impulses. But the work is never done, as we know, and there's a fair amount of work to go.
Thanks so much, Mitch. Maybe I can turn to you now, and with your experience, give us a little bit of your reading from this. What are the key messages you took away? I mean, we'll be digesting it for a while, but what are your first impressions? I think you might be muted, Mitch.
Thank you. I associate myself and accept all of Neera's comments. I think she's very right and perceptive. A couple of basic things that sometimes we forget to recognize, and we don't look at what's right in front of us. First of all, this was a decisive election. People would say, well, what are you talking about? Well, because for the last 2 weeks, all the week and a half, the media has been going back and forth as though it's been close, and the world's been watching Arizona, Georgia. Is he going to get to where he got? At the end of the day, now that the dust has settled, as Neera said to you, Joe Biden unseated an incumbent, which is almost near impossible in the United States of America. He will have 306 electoral votes, and he will have over 6 million more popular votes than Donald Trump. That's a whooping, no matter how you count it. And had we counted votes differently because of COVID and the way legislature set it, that narrative would have set in fairly early rather than where we are today. All right. However, I have to say that it was an unhappy win for a number of strange reasons. One, there was a question about whether or not this campaign was about Donald Trump himself, his personality, his authoritarian impulses, his anti-democratic way of running the greatest democracy in the world, or was it really about issues? And one of the things we got reminded of again is that the United States of America and its people are generally pretty smart about how they vote and don't like extremes. Not that they can't be attracted to it, but generally speaking, even in the Democratic Party, we're having this battle on our side of the aisle about, is the party progressive? Is it centrist? Is it a conservative Democratic Party? Or are the Republicans in the middle, or is it to the right? We now have, so incredibly, somewhat of a split government, where the United States Senate that was supposed to, or people had predicted was going to switch to, giving the Democrats the trifecta of the presidency, the House and the Senate, did not happen. Now we have another month of campaigning to do in the state of Georgia, where there are 2 Senate seats that are up for grabs. And should the Democrats win those seats, then all of a sudden the Democrats would have swept all 3 And those are very competitive races. And ironically, demonstrates another pretty massive trend, demographic shift. Georgia has always been red in the deep south of the United States of America, the 13 lowest southern states forever. And in the state that I live in, which is Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, have always been red. All of a sudden, Georgia is looking like it's going to flip. And long term, if states like Georgia and North Carolina get to be in play, and the Democrats are able to maintain an ability to govern well, according to the people in the West of New Mexico and Arizona, then the map will change. And so, as Neera said, when the dust settles, I think you'll see that President-elect Biden put a new coalition together, much like President Trump did last time. And all of us political people have to keep remembering to stop running campaigns in the past and running the last campaign, and always run the campaign in the future. So where are we? We have a president-elect that is well known to everybody in the world, world leaders in different countries. I think the world took a collective, breath and have a sigh of relief that they now have somebody that is predictable and steady to work with. I know you guys are going to talk a little bit about this tomorrow, but President-elect Biden is much more of a traditionalist in the sense of transatlantic relationships. He also, on the domestic side, is going to, I think, surprise people and be somewhat more transformational than he set out to be when he started this race. The impetus for his election and the initial cause was to say, look, the United States needs a steadying influence. They need somebody who plays within the lines, somebody who is going to be reasonable, and somebody who's going to stabilize the country so that we can prepare for the future. But as the election went on, I think it occurred to him that he actually can be, without scaring people, a transformational leader. I think that you're going to see him to be being a little less cautious than he was as a deal maker when he was in the Senate. It's just a guess. I don't know. Now, some of this is going to depend on whether the Senate flips. If the Senate is in the hands of the Republicans, then we're going to have a status quo 4 years and a lot of, passionate arguments without, dramatic changes in much, although I'm sure there'll be incremental progress. And ironically, the thing that I think that the most effective tool he will have is one that President Trump gave him, which is the expansive use of his executive authority that went unchallenged by the Republicans, that I am sure President-elect Biden will use to full force and effect if they can't get anything through a recalcitrant Republican Senate. And if Mitch McConnell decides, and I hope that he doesn't, to not be the same kind of obstruction as he was when President Obama was in office, when he famously said, my mission is to stop you from doing anything. I hope that's not true. I think America hopes, given the current state, should the Senate stay in the hands of the Republicans, that the Vice President and Mitch McConnell are able to confect reasonable and thoughtful, deals around COVID, around economics. Of course, race continues to be a huge issue in the United States of America. And I'll finally just end with this. The sadder part of the election is I think a lot of people were hoping that Trump was just a mistake, that the 4 years ago was just an aberration. It turns out that our country has some really, tough differences with itself. And we are trying to sort that out through the elections and over time. And I don't think we're there yet. I think we have a very long way to go. Much more importantly, as a country, we have to figure out how to be different, but still get stuff done. And we lost the muscle memory to do that. I know people have ideological differences. I was a mayor. We like to say that we don't have a Republican or a Democratic way to fill a pothole. The country, regular folks are just looking for government to get stuff done, to improve their lives so that everybody can have an opportunity to feed their family. And they're frustrated that Washington has not yet been able to find a way to get that stuff done. Ideology is always going to be a part of it. People can be passionate about what it is, but what they don't want is absolutely nothing happening. Something's got to get done. Not the least of which is, and it should happen right away, another package on COVID relief so that individuals and businesses can actually be protected, which of course, as you know, has been held up for a long period of time. So I think the country is going to accept Vice President Biden really well. He's a lovely guy. People who know him love him. For those of you who have spent time with him, he's going to work hard. He's honest. He's got a great sense And he's one of the most underestimated politicians in the history of the country. Everybody counted him out from the beginning. They said he would never make it. But think about it from this perspective, and I'll end with this. He is the most well-credentialed, experienced person to ever assume the office of the presidency in terms of knowledge of government and how it works in relationships that have been built around the world. So I'm expecting them to be very, very successful, but I expect it to be a very contentious 4 years as America tries to find herself and get her legs underneath her.
Mitch, thank you very much indeed. I mean, and I raised a couple of questions there that I really want to come back to before we open it up to everyone who's on. But I maybe wanted to pick up with Megan, if I could, on some of the, just sort of on the issue question that Mitch raised for us, which is, you know, in a sense, Trump tried to run on the strength of the economy pre-COVID. It's arguable maybe that without COVID, the election result could have been different. I mean, reflect just a little bit on that, on the politics as well, if you like, but I know you have a particular lens into the economic side or political economy side of this, and we'd love to hear it. So Megan, over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So I think from a couple different perspectives, we could say that the old adage, it's the economy stupid, did actually apply in this election as well. You had the Pew Research survey come out before the election showing that when voters were asked what issues were important to their voter decision, a majority, the most, said the economy, 79%. Healthcare came second. Judges came third, and actually the coronavirus only ranked fourth. Much to my surprise, inequality was way down the list, but the economy was number one. And that was also sort of echoed in various exit polls as well. So whether you called it the economy or a safe pair of hands, or you looked at the priority of opening up the economy versus managing the virus, it seemed like voters wanted a safe pair of hands, but they were worried about the economy. I also think these exit polls suggest how divided the country is. So 80% of Biden voters, for example, thought it was much more important to manage the virus than to rebuild the economy. That's compared with only 18% of Trump voters. So I think that is an issue that we're going to have to face. But generally, I think there are a couple big takeaways we can take if you zoom out and go with a macro picture from this election. First of all, there's been a longstanding belief, particularly among Democrats, that there's going to be this long secular decline of Republicans because they get the white male vote, and given demographic change, white men are in decline, and so surely naturally the Democrats could do better. That view was completely undermined in this election. So we've discovered that Trump's support increased from 2016 among every single demographic except for white men, which is really surprising. So I think that's a take-home lesson. I also think, and this is also with respect to polls and what issues we're asking about, that the liberal elite have no idea what people want in a modern democracy. I think that, we've all been surprised by this. I think that's a lesson we can take away. And then I think generally the US fired the CEO, but we only fired the CEO, right? So it wasn't, I agree with Mitch, it was a decisive victory in the end, even though, I lost all my fingernails because I bit them all off watching the votes come in. That was just a peculiarity of this particular election in a pandemic with lots of mail-in ballots and early voting. But that being said, the Republicans increased their representation in the House, and Senate is still up for grabs. There will be a runoff in 2 Senate races on January 5th in Georgia, and that will really determine who controls the Senate. And so it does seem like it's possible the Democrats might win those 2 runoff races, but it's not my base case scenario. And if that's right, if I'm right, then basically we fired the CEO, we put in a safer pair of hands at the helm, but we also reinstated Mitch McConnell to make sure that he can't do anything. So I think a take-home lesson is that the US just isn't that progressive. We're pretty conservative, actually. And so we wanted a safer pair of hands, but we don't actually want radical change. We want a candidate who's going to be centrist. And then finally, I would agree with Mitch's comment about Trumpism. I think Trumpism is here to stay, whatever happens to Trump. And he might not go away, incidentally. But I do think that he's proven that his brand of kind of nationalism protectionism, and you know, Biden has had to adopt some of the protectionism, is here to stay. Ultimately, the difference between the Make America Great strategy and the Buy American strategy isn't quite as huge as, you know, most international audiences I speak to would like to believe. So I think we can expect more Trumpism from here on out. I'll leave my comments there, though.
Megan, thank you very much. And Mario, let me turn to you. And you've been listening patiently to all of this. You're sitting in Europe looking at all of this, a keen observer, though, of what's going on in American politics. How do you read it? What did you see happen? Anything surprised you?
Well, I was surprised by some of the aspects which have already been mentioned, by the huge turnout, but by the huge Republican turnout. We have been arguing for a long time that somehow the current Republican electoral base cannot expand beyond a certain limit. And as Megan pointed out, Trump and the Republicans were able, on the contrary, to increase the share of the votes according to the exit polls, which must be managed a bit carefully, of course. But basically, in all the demographics, with the exception, the crucial exception of white men. Even when we look at women, white women, according to the exit poll, we have went 55 to 43 to the Republicans, which is much more than in the midterm, in the 2018 midterm. That's surprising to me, but that's somehow connected to the high level of polarization we are seeing in the US society. We know that the drivers are multiple and very different, but the electoral outcome is this kind of, polarized electorate. And of course, Biden won. It's a commanding victory, it seems. But at the same time, as all the other participants said, that victory did not translate in a nationwide victory. In Congress, we have this question mark over the Senate. And even with a 50-50 situation, it will be very difficult to implement, I think, a bold, ambitious agenda. Moreover, if we look at the state elections, at state legislators, on which I understand, on which the Democrats invested a lot, there was a remarkable degree of stability, a low level of mobility. The Democrats lost New Hampshire, if I'm not mistaken. But it's important because in 2020, the new census will kick in. There will be some redistricting to do. And in some states, I think of Texas, some states will significantly increase their congressional delegation, Texas from 36 to 38, 39. And finally, one last point. In such polarized system with possibly at best a weak majority, a very feeble majority in the Senate, it will be very difficult to govern by legislation. By the way, we have seen that with Obama, we have seen that with Trump. It's very difficult to pass legislation in Congress. So presidents govern more and more via executive orders, presidential statements, by proclamations and so forth and so on, by giving precise indications to the federal bureaucracies on how to understand and implement a given law, which is problematic on multiple counts, even on basic democratic ground. It's problematic also in terms of governmental efficacy, because at the end of the day, the legacy those administrations left, both Obama and Trump, are legacies often, left on the sand. They can be easily reversed by a stroke of pen. And that has also implications for foreign policy, as we have seen on environmental issues and the environmental policies of Obama, which Trump quickly and effectively canceled.
Mario, thank you very much. Lots of things for us to talk about. I wanted to come back, maybe if I could, on this question of polarization, because after all, something, a little under half of the American voters voted for Trump, and that's a sort of standing reality in the United States now. It has obviously implications for the U.S. when it's seen from Europe as well. But I wanted to maybe focus in on one particular issue, which was extraordinarily, or set of issues extraordinarily prominent in the run-up to the election itself, on race, on social inclusion, on the social side of the progressive agenda, and what was made of those things by the two candidates. And they made very different things of them in the campaign. I noticed Biden has talked about that as being one of his top priorities, for the months ahead. I mean, maybe to come back a little bit on that, Mitch, if I could start with you, maybe because you're so active on this issue and been very outspoken on it. I mean, how did you see that play itself out in the campaign? What does it tell us about where we can go?
Well, a couple of things. Mario made some good points that I want to go back to, and then talk about race. It's funny. People say, "Gosh, the election was so close." Every election that I've run 9 elections, I've won 7 and I've lost 2. They're all close. 52-48, 51-49, and nobody comes out of that with a narrative, which is, "Gosh, Mitch's legislative district is so split." That's the way elections are. That's the way they're run. So my view of this is that it was closer than people thought it was going to be. But again, I think that historically it was a pretty significant win. Now, having said that, the United States of America is not split in 2. It's not half and half. Each side of these aisles is very multi-dimensional. And people voted for different reasons. I happen to think that the people of America, the majority of them, just got tired of Donald Trump. That he was unsafe. He was unsavory. He was autocratic. He was something that over time they were struggling with. Well, I don't really like him, but I like his policy. So what should I do? And they basically decided we needed somebody else. And think about who they picked. They picked the steadiest hand that was in the race with all of the candidates. So think back to all of the folks that were running against Biden on the Democratic side. And most everybody said, look, we want to pick stability. They picked another old white guy who had been there forever, that they knew well, because they wanted him to stabilize the country. I think that that's a very good thing. Now, as erratic as Trump is, every day before the election, you held your breath thinking, how is this thing, going to move? And I do think his banal approach to COVID cost him a lot, because I think people just thought that it was reckless. And I think people in America felt unsafe with having a powerful person, be so reckless in an office that could actually put the world on fire, with a tweet. And so I think there was a lot of that. All right, that's number one. Number two, I want to go back to a point that Mario made that I want to tell my Democratic friends about. I think that some of us political people got lazy and started thinking, oh, wow, with all the demographic shifts in the country, we're in good shape. In 2040, the country is going to be majority black and brown, not majority white. The Republican Party is going to shrink, primarily because they won't learn. They had a hard time learning the lesson about reaching out and have doubled down on Trump's notion of white supremacy and nationalism, which was hostile to people who were brown and of color. But in the polling that my organization did across the 13 southern states, we found out very early that is not accurate. And this election, I think, proved the point. And you noted, I think, that Donald Trump got more African-American men to vote for him than before. And also the Hispanic, Latinx, Latino population is definitely up for grabs, because people who don't understand that population, they look at it and think it's a monolithic population, when in fact it's incredibly diverse from different countries, different religious backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, and different relationships to the forms of government in the countries that they came from. So when the progressive wing of the Democratic Party put themselves in a position of being tagged as socialist and communist, and then used phrases that then got turned against them, some members of the Hispanic community went, that's not my cup of tea, and they moved. And it demonstrated, it should, to smart Republican folks, wow, we actually, if we are thoughtful and we want to run a campaign based on ideas, and we're not pushing away people because of race, we actually have a chance in the marketplace of ideas to win. Now, that, to me, if I was a Republican, I'd look at this election and go, wow, we have a future. But here's the thing, and it goes to your point. If the Republican Party, and I would say writ large of America, does not deal with the issue of race, treating people who are brown and black like they're less than everybody else, we are never, ever going to be the country that we always promised the rest of the world that we're going to be. We're just not going to be able to get there because people of color are tired. They're exhausted of being treated a certain way just because of the way they look. And, if you wanted to sum this election up in the short words, you would say white people, white working class people are angry, and brown and black people are just exhausted and fed up. One way to say it, or white working class people are afraid because of trade and all that other stuff, and African Americans and brown people are just scared, and angry. And so we have this thing that we're trying to work out that doesn't get worked out in 4-year cycles. And Trump, by the way, is not necessarily the cause of this, because that stuff had laid there for a while, but he is an accelerant of it. And he put his foot on the pedal. And I think most people in America started to recognize in ourselves that that's not really who we want to be. Although that is not going to be an easy thing for us to move past, especially when you put economic anxiety on top of, and let's just call it, because this is what they mean. When they say working class Republicans, they mean white working class. When the fact of the matter is brown and black people, people of color, are all working class folks and are poor. And so we have this weird thing going on, but race, in my mind, lays right underneath everything going on in the United States of America. And our institutions are designed to continue to push us in that direction. And we have to really think about redesign. And let me get you to think about this, and then I'll close on this. In 2040, we are going to be a majority minority, but something else is going to happen. 70% of the people in this country are going to live in 15 states. That means 30 senators are going to represent 2/3 of the people. And 70 senators are going to represent only 30%. And if 70 senators are a minority, able to govern the majority of the country and don't have a Democratic outlet for that, that is going to cause huge upheaval. And that's why there are some Democratic reforms that people have to think about, because demographics are really going to reverse what the founding fathers intended when they designed our Constitution, which was for the majority to rule, and then to have the minorities' constitutional rights protected with the Bill of Rights. In 2040, if we don't change, you're actually going to have minority rule in the country. And I think that is a prescription for really, really, really challenging stuff going forward, which is why I think we've got to regroup and think about the structures that currently exist on politics and on race in the country. And we don't have a whole lot of time to start planning for that.
Mm-hmm. Neera, Megan, please, weigh in on this.
Yeah, there's a few things I would say. Maybe I would totally agree with Mayor Landrieu. I think that I would like to say a few things about the Megan and Mario's comments. Donald Trump was able, to some degree, I can sort of, he comes from this election in a very odd position, right? Because he turned out a lot of voters to vote up and down the ticket Republican, who then voted for House members, who voted for senators, and then a different coalition came out to vote against him, and some of them voted for Republicans. Maybe I totally agree, maybe as a check, maybe that's their kind of orientation, but it's not clear to me. It's not clear to me that there's another turnout operation in the future that's like Donald Trump for both sides. Right? So I think that there's, it's not just to say Ted Cruz, the future, the people we're looking at as people running in 2024, whose name is not Donald Trump or a Trump, is not motivating people to come out like this. The other thing I'd say is if it is the case that, and I think this is the case, that there were a lot of voters who don't pay a lot of attention to politics, and we have to remember, half of Americans aren't watching the news incessantly. who sort of thought like my life is kind of better off, or at least it was before the virus, and the virus is a sort of exogenous event. And so, it's okay. Then I think the real test for Joe Biden will be managing this virus effectively and well, so that the economy can kind of reopen. And I think that's going to be a test of his governance. And thankfully, a fair amount of that test does not have to do with passing large legislation. There's a lot of things a president can do to manage this virus a lot more effectively, distribute the vaccine effectively if we have one, that doesn't really require. And if that's a proof point for governance, that's something that he can focus on. I think that's one of the reasons why the first aspect of his transition is announcing an expert-led coronavirus task force.
Right. I mean, I want to let you all come in on this, but also maybe if you could, comment on Kamala Harris. We haven't spoken about her yet in all of this, but that's actually a fairly big deal on many levels. And anyway,
I think Megan wanted to respond.
Go ahead.
So I just wanted to make a couple comments. They weren't about Kamala though that is a huge achievement that sort of has gotten hidden a bit in all the drama around this election. I just wanted to highlight that according to the same Pew Research poll that I cited before, where most people said the economy was decisive in their vote, racial inequality only came in 8th on the list, which really surprised me. Below foreign policy, which, in the run up to an election, not that many people care that much about foreign policy, wrongly, I think, but that tends to be the case. Economic inequality came in 10th on the list, which I found really surprising as well. And I'd say on economic inequality, which obviously is related to racial and ethnic inequality, when you look at the difference between the two candidates, they're incredibly stark. But I guess the good thing is that a lot of what Joe Biden is trying to do to address inequality, both racial, but particularly economic inequality, he doesn't actually need control of the House and Senate to do. So a lot of his platform, and often when I talk to people, I feel like I'm the only one who read it, is to do with worker power. And boosting the power of workers to negotiate higher wages. So it's an attempt to kind of upgrade the labor market in the U.S. because what we saw in the midst of this virus was that, it was those hourly service workers who got knocked off their feet immediately, and they had hardly gotten back up on their feet after the global financial crisis. So our workforce has never, ever been so vulnerable to the kind of shock that we've experienced. And so Biden has proposed a bunch of things like helping workers unionize, encouraging unionization, punishing companies for misclassifying workers as contractors instead of giving them full benefits as they should be receiving, things like that. And actually, he probably doesn't need control of the Senate in order to do that. So there are big things like, a green infrastructure program that will be hampered if there's gridlock in DC. But something like that, which actually will make a material difference on inequality, I think he can probably still do.
Mm-hmm. Mario?
Yes, if I can pick up on this. I mean, Megan, you know very well those rankings tend to be a bit artificial. I mean, the economy includes economic inequality in a way and so forth and so on. But I do agree with you that there is an opening. On healthcare, for example, we see a broad majorities in the U.S. supporting the expansion of public healthcare. We have seen the referenda even in conservative states. So there is certainly a possibility. But I'd like to go back to what Neera was saying on Trump being such a mobilizing figure. Ted Cruz in 2024, for example, will never be able, to draw these big crowds to bring so many voters to the poll. The follow-up question is why someone like Donald Trump can mobilize people so much? Why such a primitive racial form of nationalism is so mobilizing? And I have the impression sometimes that the genius has left the bottle, and it will be fairly difficult to bring it back in. Biden is offering an Obama-style form of inclusive civic nationalism based on the idea that the Constitution is flexible, can evolve and change over time, include more and more. But the big, immense challenge is to combine that kind of patriotic appeal, that kind of civic nationalism, with the inner intrinsic cosmopolitanism of many Americas. I mean, Mitch was mentioning the transformation of the South. In the South, you have cities, advanced service-based economies in the cities, which are fully included in these dynamics of global integration, from Austin to Charlotte to New Orleans and others. So you have to somehow combine the cosmopolitan message with an inclusive, flexible form of civic nationalism to counter the appeal, because there is a strong appeal, we discover, of this kind of racial nationalism, which Trump has spoken so roughly, so elementarily, but also so effectively.
Okay. Well, you know what I'm going to do? We've accumulated lots and lots of questions here, and I want to try to get to at least some of them before we close out. And so if you agree, I'm going to start taking some of those now, but they really are nice sort of continuations of the things we've started to talk about, with some twists maybe. And the first question I might put to you all comes actually from our Jim Colby at GMF, former member of Congress. Who asks, first of all, he says, Mitch, you hit it exactly right. The Republican Party has an opportunity to build a new coalition based on this election, disaffected working class persons and Asian and Latino minority groups. What about the Democratic Party? How does it build a stable coalition with the progressive wing firmly in control now? And who are the future leaders? Well, first of all, do you agree the progressive wing is firmly in control of the Democratic Party? But how would you answer Jim's question?
So,
Well,
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, Neera, please, go ahead.
Please, Neera, go ahead.
I think this is I have to say, I think this is a kind of false debate. And it kind of totally drives me nuts now that we hit literally every election cycle where a center left person, sort of person more from the moderate wing wins all these races. So in this case, the truth is Joe Biden in much of the country outperformed the party. Not everywhere. There are places like, for example, Abigail Spanberger's race where some moderates outperformed Joe Biden, but he was not, he outperformed the Democratic Party in a lot of liberal districts, in fact. So, having gone through 2018 and worked very hard in 2018 to assemble a broad coalition, the reality of the United States is that for Democrats to win swing states for the country, they have, and every Democrat who's won the presidency has done this, they have to put together a coalition of moderates and liberals. There are not enough liberals in the United States. I mean, it's grown, but it's now 25%. They have to put together a coalition of moderates. Joe Biden will have won the presidency because moderates and independents swung dramatically to him, and he won a majority of them. And so I think I have to confess, I find this like a media narrative. Joe Biden was in the primary and he faced Bernie Sanders. And when it was 1-on-1, it was 2-1, right? There's a lot over the weekend. We have a big media narrative about AOC, and, she has incredible voice and power, but we are talking a group of people who are 7 or 8, maybe 9 members of Congress. So I think my view of this is that Donald Trump has an amplification machine. He was able to amplify the voices of the sort of more hard left in this election. Joe Biden will be the defining speaker for the Democratic Party. He has to have a broad coalition, and I think he signaled he will have liberals in his coalition and maybe some very strong progressives, but he's also going to have former Republicans or Republicans who supported him. And so I think that there's going to be a continual, because the media is interested in this, a continual debate about it. But I have to say, I do not see the rise of the ascendant left is ascendant in urban centers that are not competitive. There was not a single candidate, and there were a few who ran, single candidate from the left who ran in a swing state who won, not a single one. And I think the truth is that's important to the party. So
Mitch?
that's my high horse on that topic.
I completely agree with her. I'm a Democrat from the South, and on the national spectrum, nobody would accuse me of being a progressive, I don't think. Although if you were in Louisiana and you're a Republican, you would say I'm progressive. And so I think it depends. If you're in Massachusetts, or you're in New York, it's a different color blue, let me say, than you would have in Louisiana or in Georgia. For example, Stacey Abrams, who's one of our rising stars, and I should say she has risen already. If you look at her record, even though most people would say she's an incredible progressive, the truth of the matter is when she was the leader of the House of Georgia, she was noted for negotiating fairly practical deals with very conservative Republicans, which today's national progressives, would say, no, I don't want to do that. So I agree with Neera that I do think, although you have some very young, attractive voices on the progressive side that's personified by Congressman AOC, as we all call her, is really a media narrative that they're important and they have a voice, but they definitely are not in control. They're an important part of a coalition. But as Neera can say, she can run a list of names off faster than I can, but Congressman Spangenberg, and there are a whole bunch of other very moderate Democratic candidates who are real Democrats, but who are running in swing districts that by and large have much larger numbers and a much more present and a very critical part of the coalition. Now, in order for us to win, we all have to figure out how to be together, or we can't beat the other side. And as Neera said, if you look at some of the results, Biden was able to reach over that. And I just would remind everybody that he was maybe the most conservative member on the stage when he was running. I guess there were a couple of other congressmen that could have said that they were moderates, but he represented the moderate wing of the Democratic Party, and he was the one that actually got the nomination and therefore was able to cross over. And it may be true. I don't know that we know this yet, but he may have been the only Democrat in that race that could have beaten Donald Trump in the environment that we found ourselves in on election day.
Hey, go ahead, please.
Just to bring in the perspective of the financial markets for what it's worth, because I think they have a very clear view on different wings of the Democratic Party. And, the idea of a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren being the Democratic candidate was absolutely terrifying to them. I say as a former chief economist at an asset management firm. And the fact that, the Senate has been so close, and that means Elizabeth Warren couldn't be confirmed as the Treasury Secretary. I mean, they're absolutely cheering this. So it might be a small wing of the party, but it certainly has an outsized impact, or could have an outsized impact on financial markets, which of course bleeds into the economy.
Well, I'm not saying that they're not important and they don't have good voices. I know them both, and Neera doesn't like them very, very much. But this narrative that somehow they are the bulk of the party, I don't think that's accurate. I think they're an important part of it. And they're an important part of a very diverse, large coalition that makes up what we now call the Democratic Party.
Let me go to another question here. And there are a lot here, and I'm trying to group them together slightly. Some of them are with names, some of them anonymous, which is both fine. But here's someone who's writing, for voters living in places like Las Vegas, the air during vote counting felt charged and dangerous. Is the danger associated with politics something that will worsen over time? I mean, this is actually an interesting question for a European audience as well. If I can put it in sort of a colloquial term, there are kooks on the margins of parties on both sides of the Atlantic. And are we going to face things that slip over into violence, as was feared? We haven't seen it really yet. We saw it before in the run-up to the election.
So I'll just say something briefly here, which is I was actually far more worried about violence during the election, and actually real violence during the vote counting. You know, to just be honest, I think a lot of progressives or a lot of us were worried that you'd have sort of armed mobs storming vote counting at the county level, given everything that Donald Trump was saying. So, you know, obviously we have a challenge now, which is Trump is going to likely have rallies in these states, but most of the vote counting is now done or relatively close to done by the time he actually has his rallies. And, you know, I think it is I don't think we should understate, and none of us have really talked about it here, is, you know, the fact that he won't concede, the fact that he's just continuing to flat norms, his power in the party, which I think is greater than any other politicians. Hence, most of the Republican Party will not acknowledge the fact that Biden is going to be the next president. You know, I think that is continually dangerous. But I also think we should not underestimate that there have been a variety of times throughout this 4 years in which Trump has said things that, you know, a strong majority rejects. It's 60%. Is it a problem that 35%? It is a deep problem for democracy to have even 35% of the country disillusioned, or, you know, and that or just think it's like all rigged. But I would also say there were a slice of voters who post 2016, you know, a lot of Democrats said Trump was going to start a war or something. Post 2016 realized, oh, he's not that bad because he didn't do all these things that they were accused of. And I think there are going to be a lot of voters who are going to wake up a year from now and recognize Joe Biden is not an actual socialist communist who has confiscated their wealth and made us turn into Cuba. And, you know, they might also just move. So that is my hope, that actual results can build some interstitial tissue in the country. And I actually think the COVID response, which is something that, you know, Obama didn't have, it's not good, but Joe Biden has the ability to actually deliver results for people's lives in tangible ways that I hope can bridge these differences.
Can I just leap in here for a second?
Please.
To me, what's more troublesome, worrying of these past few years in the US and in Europe and in the communication between the two is that a sort of violent, vulgar, as I said, very primitive political discourse has occupied the center stage and has been almost, you know, legitimized as the new normal of the political conversation. A sort of, you know, house of cards narrative of what politics is and should be about. And on that, the Trump's rhetoric has been toxic. I mean, the president has a unique pedagogical function. When he, or hopefully in the future, he or she speaks to a double large audience within the US and outside of the US, also to a global public opinion. If that pedagogical message takes the form of Trump's message, the reverberation and consequences can be very toxic, as I said. And we saw that in Europe. Somehow Trump was taken and presented as a model by fringe radical groups who then, you know, were able to build on that. I mean, I'm Italian, I live in France. It was very visible both in Italy and France, even more in Italy, perhaps, with the rise of Salvini and the League and so forth and so on. So that's problematic. Time will show how, you know, long-lasting and solid that legacy will be. But it's a poisonous legacy that has come out of those 4 years of Trump in power.
Mm-hmm. We have several questions here, in a way follow on from what you've just said, Mario. And let me, if you allow me, group a couple of them together. They're basically about the future of the Republican Party. We started to talk about that a little bit, but you know, it sort of boils down to how essential will Donald Trump be to the future of do they need him? Do they still need him? Will they turn away from him? Is there something in what's playing out right at the moment that's going to finally sort of be the straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of Republicans sticking with him? How do you see that?
Implicit in that question is that the Republican Party has a choice. They don't. I'll make a prediction for you. Donald Trump's mission in life is to be the center of the universe. That explains everything that he ever does. If you just want to know what he's going to do, just whatever makes him the center of it, that's what he's going to do. He has now tasted the presidency. He's tasted the most powerful office in the world. And I predict for you that he will actually be the candidate in 2024. I don't think he's going to go away. I think that he will set himself up outside of government. He will create some kind of business that keeps him in the forefront. He will troll Joe Biden for years. He will continue to have rallies. And I think that he will be the candidate. And I don't think that any other Republican will come close to beating him in the primaries 4 years from now. I know that's a scary thought, but I think that it's going to happen. It would just surprise me if he went away.
Well, I'm interested in what others think about this, but I also want to put my little twist on it as well. Is why all of these sort of things that go directly to his personality, these accusations of corruption, the tax return issue, his behavior, generally, all of these things, which were kind of outrageous at some level, seem to roll right off of him, at least as far as his base was concerned. Why?
So I think there's a misunderstanding, a little bit, not a misunderstanding. I mean, the negative aspects of Donald Trump made a lot of people vote against him. And some of these people are very moderate people. I mean, like Biden brought a lot of Romney voters. People who voted for Mitt Romney came out and voted for Joe Biden. And again, they're not like super liberals. So they didn't, they often voted for Republican, sometimes in the House or in the Senate, but they chose to break at enough level. And some of them have left the Republican Party and become independents. They haven't become Democrats, they've become independents. So I actually agree. I mean, I actually think the way he behaved and his flouting of laws, etc., started driving white college educated women against him and brought all these other folks to vote against him. But I would agree with Mitch. Like, I think the truth is there is no Republican who has the hold he has. And I think that is, I think everyone should prepare for him running again. And I think the question is, there's one issue I think for him, which is his base. There are elements of his base who love him because he's always a winner. And when he actually leaves the government, he will not be the winner he was. So, maybe they'll overcome that. But it was a driving narrative from his primary in 2016 that he is a winner because he's a billionaire, which makes him a winner. And always saying, always winning is really important to, some of their love for him. Whether that breaks off even a small percentage, I don't know.
But Neera, don't you think that's the reason why, aside the fact that he feels very aggrieved that he's pushing this narrative, they took it from me so that he could, and it was unfair, and lo and behold, they come up with a cure for the virus right after I leave office, which because of Pfizer's announcement today, and that he's going to use that as a way, as a cudgel to say, you know what, it was wrongly taken from me, and I'm going to take it back and make America great again for the third time. So I don't know.
Yeah, I definitely think he's going to do that. I think it's I think we're going to live with a version of the lost cause narrative here, right?
Yeah,
which is you are never really, he can't lose. He only can be cheated. That is like Donald Trump. I'm just saying, there are levels of reality that permeate. And the truth is, if he has control of 65% of that party, even if it dwindles to 70% in a new world, which is possible, then he's he controls the party. And he doesn't control America, but he controls the party.
Right. So I would agree that Donald Trump is not going to leave easily, but I'd also say that 4 years is a really long time. And if Trump spends 4 years embroiled in legal battles and has a TV show that serves as his bully pit, that doesn't necessarily mean that he'll maintain a big hold on the Republican Party. And there are some interesting alternatives to Trump who don't look like they could really compete with Trump right now, but might in 4 years' time. I mean, there's the traditional Trumpists like Nikki Haley, Ted Cruz. interestingly and most terrifying in my view are the kind of the young reformers. So that's the Tom Cottons, the Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio, and they're going to look to, I mean, they've studied Trump's brand of populism and are looking to kind of improve on that. And in my view, they're much cleverer than Trump. So I think that they could be real contenders. And then there's kind of a final group of Trump's heirs. So, Donald Trump Jr. maybe, or Javanka, one of them might try to give him a run for it. But I think it's the young reformers who actually might stand a chance because they're looking to capitalize on what Trump has already done. And in 4 years' time, it seems like Trump is ever present now. I will say he seems a bit more irrelevant to me already, just in losing the presidency. So even though he's still technically there. So we'll see.
What does he do for the next weeks? I mean, leaving aside the question of concession speeches and calls and all the rest of it, just in practical terms, a lame duck president in this very extraordinary position still has 2 months and a bit left to govern. What can he do? What will he do?
Well, as somebody who's gone through a bunch of different transitions, what he's supposed to do is to reach out to the person who's coming into office, give them full access. So because we're a continuous government from the beginning of time until today. And it's supposed to be a seamless and a smooth transition of power so that the people can be protected. He's not obviously going to do that. But we could sit here and talk all days about why he's not going to do that. My guess is that he's going to continue to brood. He's gotten himself into a really weird conundrum because if he allows the GSA, Government Services Administration, to give Biden $7 billion for the transition, he will admit that he's not going to be the president. He can't admit that because he doesn't want to say that he wasn't cheated, and those recounts don't. I mean, the certification doesn't actually become executable for a bit. So he's kind of gotten himself stuck and the country stuck. And he basically will spend his time complaining. The most hopeful thing that can happen is Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi can get together and decide to pass a package that the president can't veto. Now, weirdly enough, the president, during the middle of that negotiation, said he actually wanted to go further than the House Democrats, and the Senate Republicans said they didn't want to go that far. So there's a deal in there somewhere, and it's so important and so necessary that they get that done. And if they get that done, just that one thing, maybe the air will come out of the balloon and the rest of it will just be political talk for the next 60 days. And the Biden administration in waiting is so experienced that I'm not saying they don't need, the kind of transition that a newbie would need, but they've been there before and they've been working on it for a long time. So I think we're going to be okay, but he's not going to be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say Trump could announce a whole bunch of regulations. He could fire a lot of people. So that would probably be undone in pretty short order once the Biden administration has come in. But interestingly, the EU's, it seems, looking to announce new tariffs on the U.S. As sort of a way to negotiate with the U.S. And it might be a smart move, but it could also provoke a pretty wounded president. So we could end up seeing more tariffs on some of our allies as well. And, I think generally with tariffs, that's not Biden's approach to things, but I also don't think he'll walk in and immediately repeal them without extracting some concessions first. So that's another option for Trump.
I think probably we'll come back to that in our discussion tomorrow, which is going to focus, very much on those issues. Let me ask you, and I know I'm conscious of our time as well, but I didn't want to end without getting to this question of the polls. The polls at some level were not that wrong, but they weren't what was predicted. And of course, we have a history with this now. It wasn't just in 2016, but even in 2012, where the polls weren't quite right. What is this telling us? Is it telling us anything particularly significant, or is it, we were talking about this a little bit earlier before we started our discussion with Mario and others, maybe in some sense, politics has evolved beyond traditional polling, and it's just not capturing the phenomena that are some of the things we've been talking about, in fact, when people get into the polling booth. Or should we simply not worry too much about that? Thoughts on
I'll just say a few words. I don't know what to say about the polls. I think the polls were dramatically off. I'll say, I think Mitch probably has the same experience. There are definitely people in the last week of the campaign who thought the Senate was getting really challenging. It was not like the internal polls didn't pick up the fact that Republicans could win a lot of those races, from Sarah Gideon to North Carolina. A range of races, and a lot of people thought Florida was getting more difficult. So I don't know that the internal polling was totally wrong. And I actually think the Biden campaign was pretty accurate about where they saw things going. They never invested heavily in Texas. They thought towards the end Georgia would do better than Florida. So that kind of thing was an issue. I think the truth of this race right now is, if the polls had been accurate, people would feel like this was a historic victory for Joe Biden. It's really because people thought it was not so close. But if they had assumed it was close, then it would seem like a historic victory. So I have a great deal of frustration. I think there's a lot of discussion about, it's not really shy Trump voters. It's more like just rural voters are hard to capture, and they aren't really responding in the same way. But I think, I have to say, any discussion of polls at this point, I take with a grain of salt on attitudes or anything else, because all of them, in some sense, if you're not, they're predictions of what they've always been predictions about who's going to turn out in some sense. And, that was broadly inaccurate.
Mario.
If I may, yes. No, I'm a bit ambivalent myself. As a scholar, I need polls. I also kind of like them. It's like they give a sort of, sports-like quality to politics. So I like looking at polls and how they evolve. At the same time, they are not, I'm not saying they are unreliable, but in a highly polarized context, which is the US, but not just the US, the margin of error of polls is so wide that what they tell us can be technically correct, but also often useless given this margin of error. So yeah, we need polls, but we must be careful and not, over relying on polls, given all of that.
I'd say a lot of the polls in the Senate in particular were beyond the margin of error, though. And so pollsters went through an entire methodological rethink between 2016 and 2020. I think this just shows that there's more work to be done.
Yeah, as a politician who relies on polls, it scares the hell out of me that they were so wrong. Because you use them as a tool. They're a diagnostic tool that tells you where to go and what to do, and whether what you're doing is working or not working. If you can't rely on the information, then you're flying more blind than you necessarily would want to be. So I was really disappointed. Not just because the team that I wanted to win didn't win, but I was disappointed in the science of it that we had come to rely on. Seems to be off. And I think they really have to get back to the drawing board and try to figure out why they missed. It's true that they didn't miss, completely, but they missed enough to cause you concern. They missed enough that if you said the plane was going to hit the runway, but they were going to be off by that much, you'd be scared that you were going to crash. and that's plenty enough to be off for them to be concerned about it.
Mayor Landrieu, or others who might have thought, why were they so wrong?
I don't know.
I don't think we know. I really don't think they know why. I really don't think they know why they were wrong.
Yeah. Of course, there have been some very big polling surprises in Europe too. So this is a transatlantic phenomenon, to say the least. Right?
I don't know if they're just skewing towards, I don't know if it's just like college educated people are responding to the polls more or just talking to them more. As Megan said, they've weighted polls towards more white non-college voters in the last 4 years since 2016. And the weighting wasn't sufficient. So that's the challenge.
I suppose it's also true that Trump convinced some of his folks not to tell pollsters what they really think. I don't. When they said just don't respond, there was I think when we go back and look at this, there was a lot of stuff going on in social media that was being pushed out by campaigns that weren't necessarily as visible as they should have been. And because of technology, people are communicating in different ways and not traditionally, with pollsters. But I think they should figure it out, because as as somebody who wants to be able to rely on good data, if you can't trust that the data is good, you have to start relying on it. And then it becomes, not useful. And so they missed, though. There's no question about it. That was a big miss.
So
But-
Mitch
but
is just
Mitch-
referencing, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that similar mistakes, if not worse, were made in Europe from Brexit onwards. So there is something, larger than Trump not telling his voters not to pick up the phone. And somehow my impression is very impressionistic, but my impression is there is somehow they express a reaction, an anti-political, anti-elitist kind of reaction, which is skepticism towards traditional journalism, refusal to answer the polls, and so forth and so on. So I believe there is that dimension as well. It's not the only explanation. It's just one of the many variables which can explain these flaws of current polls.
Yeah, I think as politics gets more polarized on both sides of the Atlantic, also there's the shy voter phenomenon where if you're supporting a much more extreme candidate, you might feel like you shouldn't admit that publicly. And so that ends up creating surprises when you actually have.
Well, you make such a good point. I do think that, and this is an unfortunate condition that we've created. People get hassled publicly when they tell other people who they're for and their arguments. And most people don't want to do that. They want to be able to vote for who they vote for in peace and quiet and in safety. And it may very well be that folks are just not telling people, and that could cut both ways. If you're living in a suburban area that's got, or a rural area that's got lots of Trump signs and you're a Biden supporter, you're not telling anybody that you vote for Biden when you go, to the grocery store. And the same thing is true if you're in the city of New Orleans, and you're downtown in the French Quarter. You're not walking around with a Trump flag because you're gonna get hassled. And it's gotten that's too hostile. Some of these things early on a year ago, when some of Trump's folks would go to restaurants, they would get hassled or vice versa. That's just really bad. And I would say this just writ large. If you back up 40,000 feet, it is not good for a country to be at each other's throats like this. This is not a good way to be in terms of effective governing going forward. We have to really think about why we are where we are and choose to get better about that. It's okay if you're ideologically polarized, but attitudinally, where families are not or splitting up or not going to holidays together or things of that nature, I just think that's not a prescription, for a good situation going forward.
Yeah, Landrieu, thank you. I mean, that's a wonderful way for us to end our conversation. I apologize, we have to end it because we are out of time and I'm conscious of our time. I apologize to all those who would ask questions. There were over 30 of them, which we weren't going to get to directly, but indirectly, I think we got to a good deal of them. So thank you for all of that. Mayor Landrieu, Megan, Neera, Mario, thank you for joining us. Thank you for this very lively conversation. A big thanks to the Foundation for European Progressive Studies for partnering with us on this conversation, but also on other things, including the one we're going to have tomorrow, which is going to look more directly at foreign policy and US-EU relations. So please do join us for that. It will be at 4 p.m. actually, Brussels time tomorrow with a really great group. So we hope to see you all then. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at GMF
Thank you.
soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.